And we are going.
Okay.
Jeremy Corbell, welcome to the Richard Dolan Show, where every week we fight the good fight. I don't know if you knew that, but now you do. Welcome. Very happy to have you on here. We had a little bit of a technical issue just as we were starting. It's all my fault, of course. What do I know? But here we are, Google Hangouts. So my solution is, my wife's trusty iPhone earbuds, which is the only audio solution I have right now. I need to take a few more classes on this. So enough with that. Jeremy Corbell, you are the, I have felt for a long time, you're the best UFO-related documentary filmmaker that we have today. You've been doing so much amazing work lately. We, in fact, just spoke a month or a month and a half ago about your previous documentary on the hunt for the skinwalker, which I loved. I thought was outstanding. And but you even then were saying, I got something even bigger in the works, documentary on Bob Lazar, and now it is out. Please talk about it.
All right, let's get started properly. I don't do many of these live video broadcasts, so I have a friend with me for moral support. He's a wrestler, and he's going to open my beer for me right now. So, Richard, now we're starting right. So the Bob Lazar,
the smart way, you've hidden the label. That's, you're not supposed to let the label show.
Never see a label because you should always have a hand around it.
There you go.
Right. So listen, honestly, thank you for having me on. It's a great pleasure to be on your show. You really, kind of hit the nail on the head when you dive into things. And I hope today we can do a deep dive into all things Bob Lazar. That's what the fans want. That's what the public wants. That's what the public has wanted for 30 years. This story, it came forward in 1989 with George Knapp. He brought it to the world, and Bob Lazar came forward to protect himself. Whether you believe that or not, that's the truth. That's how it happened. Now, beyond that, what we can all agree on is that this story spread around the world instantaneously and to this day with equal power. It has been strong. It has weaponized the curiosity of the public. And after Bob came forward with George, it achieved what he wanted to protect himself. And for all intents and purposes, he went silent. He went away. He's never gone on a UFO circuit tour. He's never, gone and talked, publicly for cash and money. No, that wasn't the point. So this movie is a miracle. It is an absolute miracle. The fact that I can now share this with you, because the only times before you've seen Bob is because George Knapp twisted both of his arms just to get him to say, hey, remind the public your story is important. So I'll just start by saying, for 30 years, the critics of Bob Lazar have gone relatively unopposed. They've been holding the mic for 30 years. And starting on December 3rd with the world premiere, we're taking the fucking mic back.
Well, I just want to point out, I think most people who are listening to this conversation do know who Bob Lazar is, what his significance is. But I just want to say very briefly, it is through Bob Lazar that the world actually learned about this place called Area 51. There had been rumors, there had been some quiet talk about it over the years, nicknamed Dreamland, Groom Lake, and so forth, out in the middle of nowhere in Nevada. But it was Lazar who started talking about it. And it was, so in other words, the world learned about Area 51 through a UFO connection. That's one very important fact that I think is worth remembering. And then, of course, Lazar's fundamental claim is that, he had a few assignments working just south of Area 51 in a place he called S4, which I believe has now been confirmed more than one time.
You didn't call it S4. The base called it S4. In 1989, nobody had ever heard it, never been in a publication, never mentioned it publicly once. And George Knapp called the base in 1989, and they confirmed special project at a base called S4. In fact, we have multiple. They won't
exactly. And just to wrap up this little overview of Lazar, I think it's important for people to know. So he said he had worked at S4 on really for just for a few months to study and help reverse engineer alien propulsion systems. He saw a number of alien craft, and he was adamant these are alien craft, not human experimental craft. You can get into that. And ever since then, the world has really come down on him. I will just say, from my own perspective, I finally, wrote about Lazar in one of my books about a decade ago. And just to be honest with you, like, I dreaded writing about him in the ramp up to that, because I knew this was just such a hot potato, and no matter what I would conclude, someone was not going to be happy, and that's just how life is. But I definitely concluded, after going through all of his testimony, I didn't have a lot of access to video during that period, but I had his transcripts. And the thing about Lazar you find is a complete consistency with everything that he always said about what he did. And he would never allow himself to be dragged into extrapolating in areas where he didn't have knowledge. He was always very, very careful and consistent with everything that he said about his experience. And I was always impressed by that.
Look, it's our job, not only to report the news, and, mine happens to be in the medium of film, but we're doing the same thing. It's our job to promote the news, to let people know. But I also believe it's our job, when we have looked at enough evidence, to stand for what we believe in. And so I'm willing to do that today, and I'm willing to do that going forward. I feel very confident that what I'm reporting to you is valid, and it's valuable, and that you need to know this story, and you need to know it now, because 2 generations of people are now living who weren't even born when Bob Lazar came forward in 1989 through George Knapp. So this is a new day, a new era, and luckily this film is going to be seen by millions of people who have never heard the Bob Lazar story yet.
Please tell listeners and viewers, what are the key things that you uncovered in your investigation of Bob Lazar that would lend credence to everything that he's talked about in terms of his experience at Area 51?
Okay, so there's really, Richard, like a laundry list of things, and you have seen the movie. The public has not seen the movie. So within the movie, obviously, I go into depth in some of those things. However, I don't even go into depth into the majority of those things. Those were things that I saw along the way, that I was exposed to along the way, that allowed me to learn more and allowed me to go deeper. So there are specific things that will be revealed in the film. These little things, like my favorite part is, how did Bob know? How could he possibly have known these things if he's fabricating this story? And there's some zingers in there. But, let's just start with some for your audience, so that they get something today. Let's just start with the elephant in the room, the big one that everybody, loses sight of. How did Bob Lazar know that on Wednesday nights, the exact time, the exact location of a test flight of something that looks exactly like a flying saucer and maneuvered way outside the capacity of normal terrestrial reactionary propulsion systems? And he brought 3 groups of friends over 3 different weekends, showed them exactly, and this is not over Area 51, this is over Papoose Lake, this is over 15, 17 miles away. There's not supposed to have any activity. How did he know? How did he know that? And you can play the role of debunker, and you can play the role of trying to minimize his story by making up memes and jokes like, oh, he was a janitor at Los Alamos. George Knapp debunked that in 1989. I debunked it again later. He was a physicist. I had somebody come forward. So how did he know? How did Bob Lazar know? And that's the big one that we should just start with, because that's public. How did he know about those test flights? You tell me.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a very good point. And what we do know, at least when I was doing the historical research and trying to figure out Lazar's story, he worked at this place from the end of 1988 into early 1989. He was friendly, we'll say, with John Lear, who's another very person very well, of course, significant in this field. And it was Lazar, I believe, who had mentioned to him, like, I've learned that these test flights are taking place, and brought people on those successive weekends to see the show. And it was on the last of those that actually the guys in the camo, the Jeeps came up and detained them.
Yeah.
So, and that's when he became afraid for his safety and for his life as well.
He was enemy number one at that point. And, you know, to rub him out, you know, kind of proves what he was saying. That's why he went on the news with George Knapp. He was genuinely nervous, whether you believe it or not. You know, however, let me give you another one, because people are going to say, well, we knew that all along. And, you know, we have explanations. Okay, well, let's go to another one, because I didn't cover this in the film. Again, in the film, there are zingers. There are things that nobody has ever found, nobody ever knows, and they're coming in the film. There's a couple in particular, but one that I can talk about now, because I did not include it in the film, but it's really powerful. So I have had multiple communications with somebody who has known Bob Lazar prior to Bob Lazar being Bob the UFO guy.
Mm-hmm.
This individual knew him in LA. This individual actually used to drop him off at Caltech. So think about that for a second. So if Bob Lazar's lying about his education, lying about all that stuff, you know, which I'm willing to accept, that has nothing to do with Area 51. I would be willing to accept that. But he was making a good show of it all the way back then when he had nothing, you know, no UFO.
This is the thing. Like, yeah, Lazar, probably the biggest thing that people really came down on, Stanton Friedman, and aside from a lot of other actual hardcore debunkers of UFOs, have all said Lazar is a fraud because he lied about his education. He said he went to MIT.
Let's get to that in 1 second. I want to get to that, but I want to just say one thing first, which is that this guy I'm talking with, his name is Jim Tagliani. He knew Bob before. He knew him from LA. He knew Bob when Bob felt sorry for John Lear for believing in UFOs because he was from a prominent family and Bob thought all UFOs were fantasy. And Jim Tagliani, he worked at Area 52, confirmed at the exact time that Bob Lazar was coming forward on the news. So here's a guy in a position at Area 52, and a story that people don't know. He mentioned to some workers at Area 52 up at Tonopah Test Range, where all the stealth stuff was being done, the night that Bob Lazar first went on the news with George Knapp to protect himself, longtime friend, and he got detained after that. He had the internal investigation team, whoever they were, I don't remember the name of the office, that detained him and questioned him about his knowledge and relationship with this guy, Bob Lazar. So clearly, what Bob did came forward was high on the radar, and I got to tell you, his friend believes him. His friend believes him beyond a shadow of a doubt. So
yeah, that's very interesting. One thing that you pointed out in the documentary, which I very much enjoyed, I thought it was outstanding. But you had a couple of friends of Lazar, as well as some family members too. I thought that was very, very nice. But you mentioned this one individual who drove him to Caltech and did it on a regular basis. The thing that I've always wondered about Lazar was, you know, I don't know if he had a degree there or if he was just auditing courses or taking courses. And again, the fact is, you know, the claims of the education are really somewhat very secondary, in my opinion, to the evidence that he was where he says he was. And then the other thing is his experience previously at Los Alamos National Labs, which, of course, you pointed out, George Knapp had researched for years before that. Lazar was there, was employed in a physicist capacity, not as a temp or anything like that, and was listed in the Los Alamos directory. And it is very obvious that it's through the Los Alamos connection that he met Edward Teller, the famous physicist, on that one occasion where Lazar made the local newspapers because he's the designer of these awesome jet cars. Teller meets him, they have a conversation, and as Lazar always said later, it was through his connection with Teller that he was able to get his interview with EG&G.
EG&G, and I'll tell you something else is dawning on me that I didn't put in the movie, because this movie is not just for the people that want to debunk Bob. This movie is about, you know, showing somebody and who they are, somebody that has literally been erased, you know, both by, if you believe the story, by governmental agencies, but, you know, also his identity, because everybody's projecting an identity on him. So I'm going to go a little bit further. I'm going to tell you a couple things. So yeah, George did prove back in 1989 that Bob Lazar worked in scientific capacity at Los Alamos. He went with Bob to the Meson Particle Accelerator and absolutely walked through, he says, like a rabbit in his burrow, and they filmed it, and George filmed it. And we couldn't find any of that footage. However, in the film, there is footage of Bob going through Los Alamos. Now, something else I didn't put in the film. So I was able to contact a lot of these people. So I contacted the guy that actually did the interview with Bob when he was Bob the jet car guy at Los Alamos before he was Bob the UFO guy. And I said, was Bob a physicist? He said, yes, Bob was a physicist. His last name was England. He was the writer of the article. And I said, do you believe, Bob, that he was a physicist there? He goes, yeah, he was a physicist there. I did the article. And I said, well, do you believe that he met Ed Teller? He goes, yeah, I believe Ed Teller, because I did an interview with Ed Teller the next day, and Bob's image was on the front cover of the Los Alamos Monitor on the day I did that interview, and he did a lecture. So I'm sure Bob met Ed Teller. So that's something I didn't put in the movie. But hey, man, every time you look, if you really go deeper than an inch, which has always been hard for people who looked into this, especially Stan, who started memes that were untrue and fake news, then if you look deeper, you're gonna find out that things add up. And the biggest credential that Bob has always been his ability. And I think that's really important. I don't care if Bob Lazar was homeschooled. He worked as a physicist at Los Alamos in scientific capacity when he said he did. He did meet Ed Teller, and he did get asked to be employed out at the base. I know that personally from stuff I can't put in the film, but I have faith in that. I know that to be true. So really, I'm not having that argument anymore. You can have that argument all day long. You know,
one of the things I really liked about your documentary is there's a lot of footage of Lazar both then and now. And when you look at the interviews Lazar gave back then, it's really, really instructive to watch this, because this guy is so logical, so consistent. So, I mean, I don't always like to trust my instinct or my feeling, my gut when I'm watching someone. I really much prefer to look at the evidence and to do fact checking. But the reality is, like, I think when anyone watches Lazar over any extended period of time, then and now, you see a man who's absolutely, totally consistent. And I don't know, you've met him. I only met him briefly one time, but he just strikes me as someone who, I mean, to a certain extent, he might care what other people think, but I think on a deeper level, he really doesn't. He just does what he does, and that's the end of it, you know?
Yeah, look, man, you've nailed it. I have Mickey Rourke. It's no secret. Mickey Rourke, Oscar nominated for acting. Mickey Rourke narrates the Bob Lazar film, and that's because he's a friend. And also not just because he's a friend, but because I believe that's going to uplift the medium, uplift the genre. But something Mickey says, something I had Mickey say in the film: beliefs are mercurial things, right? So you've got Bob Lazar, the person. The moment you get to know who Bob Lazar is, the entire story becomes more plausible. And so my goal with this film, because I spent a lot of time with Bob over the years, and he spent a lot of time with me, and this is what you're seeing. So what you get to see is you get a kind of passport into who he is, because one of his friends said something to me, and I'll never forget it. And his friend said, look, I'm getting goosebumps as I say this.
Mm-hmm.
He said, look, if you want to know the truth about UFOs, you just got to know the truth about Bob's character. Is he a liar, or does he tell the truth? His wife that slept next to him for 18 years, does he lie to her? His mom who raised him, does she believe him? If you get to the bottom of who Bob Lazar is, then you'll understand the truth about UFOs.
There's one moment in that documentary where you're interviewing Bob's wife, who, by the way, you can just see, these are very perfectly matched people, in my opinion. She's just as laser vision, just like Bob is. When you're yes. talking to her, she's a very, very analytical person. And I think it was, you asked her, do you believe Bob is telling the truth about his experience? And she said something like, Bob is completely honest. Like, this is how he is. He doesn't lie. Bob doesn't lie. I think she said something like that. And with just this such matter-of-fact, straightforward conviction that, I mean, it had a certain power to that. And I found myself thinking, yes, I absolutely believe her. I mean, she has been with him for all those years.
Yeah, 18 years sleeping right next to him. I mean, Joy is amazing. They hold morals and values that I think we can all relate to. They are kind, good, fair, honest people. So
it comes through. It really does come through in your treatment.
Thank you. So learning their character and who they are. You know, how do Bob's employees? You know, what do they think of him? You know, his friends, his family. I did a lot of bonus materials because I felt like that gives you a more complete understanding. You know, however, I took out the question. I asked everybody, do you believe Bob? Everybody, those close to him, those not close to him. And I felt like that was cheating in the movie. I want you to decide for yourself. And in fact, Bob wants you to decide for yourself. He's always known he's never had enough empirical data to prove to you beyond a shadow of a doubt that his story was true and that he would doubt it as well. But he's always said, I would not discount it. If you really look at it, you can't discount it. And so that's the first time Bob Lazar standing up for himself, because it's become so loud and so obnoxious by the people that have tried to twist and distort his story that it is literally time to take the mic back. And that's what we're doing.
You make a very good point in this, where the people who are closest to Bob are the people who most strongly support him, the people who've known him the longest and so forth. I just want to share a little quick story with you. Again, when I wrote my second volume of UFOs in a National Security State, it came out almost 10 years ago.
Great book, Rich, by the way. Congrats. I love that book.
Thanks. Well, that was a book where I spent about 10 or 12 pages on Lazar. And it was, I mean, out of 600 pages, but still it was a lot of work to do Lazar. And I noticed in the ramp up to the publication of that, there was a lot of anticipation, what I thought about Lazar. And I went to a conference at the end of 2008. This is a few months before that book came out. John Alexander was there.
Yeah.
And if anyone knows about John Alexander, he's a very interesting character in this field. And he came right up to me and he wanted to know what I thought of Lazar. And I said, well, I suppose I give his story a great deal of credibility. And he was like, Lazar is a complete liar, phony, don't believe a word he says. And he got right in my face that whole conference. I couldn't get away. As soon as Alexander walked away, within 2 minutes, another individual who knew Bob from way back, a fellow named Ron Regehr. I don't know if you know Ron. Good friend of mine. He's studied research UFOs out in Utah for many, many years. Defense contractor. Ron says, I'm just here to tell you, Bob Lazar, 100% authentic.
Yeah. He
says, I knew him back in the day. We blew things up. Bob was always blowing things up out in the desert.
Yeah, had a huge,
absolutely 100% honest. So within like 2 minutes of each other, I had these two people with diametrically opposite opinions. But Lazar, he's been such a polarizing figure. But I feel, and I want you to start talking again, but I just have to say this. I have firmly believed, like once I formed my conclusions on him, that he's polarizing because he's telling the truth. And when you've got someone who's telling the truth in such a provocative, profound way, because this is a profound truth, that there's going to be a tremendous amount of pushback. And I think that's completely all that we've been seeing, is this very significant pushback because of the nature of what he's had to say.
I got so many comments on that, Richard. I mean, you've seen the movie, but there are some secret little gems in there. You look at somebody now, you look at somebody 30 years later. I did a lot of that, you know, in the film to see where people still stand. Let's not forget, he passed 4 polygraph tests. If George Knapp thought for a second that this guy, this Bob Lazar guy back then, was lying, he would not have put his career on the line. He would not be publicly defending Bob Lazar to this day. So let's not get it twisted. He didn't kind of pass polygraph tests. He didn't, you know, he passed 4 separate tests.
And had no problem doing it, as I recall. He, you know, said, absolutely, I'll volunteer to do it.
He says that to this day. I researched polygraph tests now to see if it'd be more effective to get him to do it now on camera than before. And actually, it's less effective. So I chose not to do it for the movie. But Bob, immediately when I said, would you do a polygraph for the film? He goes, absolutely, put me on right now. I mean, he has absolutely zero qualm. He's telling you the truth. Now, you know, if we can handle that, that's a whole nother thing. But kind of more to your point, you know, it's this whole experience is polarizing. Now, why? Why has this struck a nerve? I mean, you can only imagine, dude. I mean, the hate mail and love mail, mostly love mail actually for this film, but it is coming in and I'm trying to respond to everybody. Why is this so polarizing? Why is Bob Lazar so polarizing? Why is he the Elvis of ufology? You know, the Bigfoot you can never catch on camera. Why is Bob Lazar so powerful? Why is he the best known name in ufology? Why is his story so embedded within popular culture that it has been everywhere, all over the world, and products made after him? Why? Why? That's the big question. The big question is why. And I gotta say, I know why. And the reason. The reason why is simply because innately you can't prove it, but you know he's telling you the truth.
Yeah, well, I think that's a big part of it. And I think the other part of it is that there were some very prominent people in the UFO community who just jumped all over him. And let's just say it, Stanton Friedman was really at the front row of all of that. And we both know Stanton. I've known him for many years and always liked and respected him. But this is the one issue I've always had a real disagreement with Stan on.
Well, look, Richard, it's like when you talk to John Alexander, okay, he comes up and says, oh, Lazar's lying. Okay, did you ask him what his proof is? Ask him specifically what his proof is that Bob Lazar is lying. If he could provide you proof, I'd want to know it. The thing is, he can't, and neither can Stan. And Stan, I'm going to be honest with you right now because I've got no problem. I like Stan as a human being. You know, as a human being, I like him. But one, he's fucking wrong. Two, he has propagated a meme mythology against Lazar, propagating things like, if he was at Los Alamos, he must have been a janitor. And now you find photos that are photoshopped of Bob as a janitor. Stan did that. Stan propagated a lie. He had a double standard for truth. He had a double standard for investigation. He had a double standard for everything. Lazar and saying, you know, if you're going to go against him, it's time for you to provide proof. Provide me proof of that. Because you can't just say and get away with it anymore. And Stan stopped being able to get away with it when I got him on stage at the International UFO Congress. It was a setup. They set me up. I didn't want to fight with anybody, but I did anyway. So my point is, someone says that to you, Richard, I'll accept it. They need to provide proof.
Well, look, I agree with you, and I don't agree with Stan on this issue, but his point would be that it's up to Lazar to provide the proof that he did work.
No. I'm saying provide proof for what you're saying. I'm saying that Stan needs to provide proof for what he's saying, not what Bob said.
Yeah. Well, Stan came down on Lazar over the whole education thing. So MIT, Caltech, unable to find any kind of records of that. And so I think, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's what really drove him to this conclusion.
Yeah, probably George Knapp conveyed that in his first news report. He said, you know, we've been unable to verify it. You know, so that has been that's been out in the public from the very beginning.
Absolutely.
But Stan went further, and he dismissed. He even tried to dismiss when I got Dr. Robert Krangel, who came forward and said I was in security briefings with Bob Lazar, the physicist at Los Alamos. He tries to diminish that interview down to saying, well, Robert Krangel only said that he wore a pocket protector, so he looked like a physicist. No, that's not what Robert Krangel said at all. If you listen to my interview, he said he knew, of course, that Bob was a physicist. He knew, of course, because they all kind of know what each other do. He says, I would have known just by the way he looked, but I knew. Stan cherry-picked quotes to try to make it seem diminished, and it's not acceptable, Richard. I'm sorry.
I have to agree. I have to agree, and it's always been distressing to me, to be honest with you. Yeah. And I'll just mention this, and this is a true story. So when I first started speaking publicly in UFOs back in 2001, I only did 2 public events that year.
I was so glad you came forward into the UFO world, Richard, because I love your voice, man. I'm glad you're here, man.
Thank you. So in November of '01 is when I met Stanton Friedman for the first time. It was a tiny little event in St. Louis, big city, but a tiny event. There was very few people there, but I got to meet him. And on the way out of that event, we were both at the airport waiting for our flights, and we sat down, had lunch. And I just have to say this, Stan really like sat me down. I was a new kid on the block, and he wanted to know what I thought about Bob Lazar. In 2001. And at that point, I hadn't written about Lazar. My first book had only covered up to the early 1970s. And to be honest with you, I was terrified over the prospect of writing about everything since then, because it was much more current and I didn't know a lot of the facts at that time. So my mind was not made up on Bob Lazar at that point. But Stan really wanted me to know that Lazar was a fraud. And I distinctly remember sitting there thinking, I will make up my mind in my own time when I'm ready. Not you, not anyone's going to force me into a position. But I was very uncomfortable with it, honestly. I was prepared to think that Lazar could be a fraud, as Stan had said, but I was also prepared to think that that's not true. And there was something about the way Stan came across that really put me off on that particular occasion. And I've always wondered, it's one thing to be skeptical about a claim. Okay, that can happen. But then to make it a cause or a crusade, which is really what he did, and it really severely damaged Lazar's credibility in the UFO field. I think Stanton Friedman by himself was able to take a lot of UFO researchers away from looking at Lazar seriously. And I think that's a real shame.
It is a real shame because his story, has so much important information in it, and you need to have a clean slate in order to try to address what he's telling you. What he's telling you in a soft, just gentle tone is a huge story. And Bob has never been one to really defend himself. He could care less. He once said, publicly, and kind of said to me, he's like, if you don't believe me, pass it on. It's done nothing good for my life. I have no motivation to lie. I have no motivation to try to tell everybody this. But I think, you keep poking a tiger, you keep poking a sleeping tiger, and eventually that tiger's going to wake up and set you straight. And so that's kind of what we're seeing these days. Now, again, he's detached from the end result. He's just got a story to tell. He knows he can't definitively prove it. However, a lot of stuff that he said, I have been able to show in the film too, have come to fruition, and also things he shouldn't have known. But I think we're just at a point now where this story is important. It has become so twisted, and they poked that tiger too many times that he was willing to let me dive deep and do this movie for you. And you're going to love it, man. This movie's going to blow people's socks off.
There's a lot in here. I would love for you to just give a little bit more. We're not going to give your whole movie away, Jeremy. People are going to want to see it. So can we give people just a little more of a sense of what you have in this movie? I would love to. George Knapp figures very heavily into it. Let me just say, actually, one thing that I liked about this movie is that you handled your subject. It's very artfully, if I can use that. I'm not really an artist. I'm not a filmmaker, but I could see there's a lot of ways you could have gone into treating the Bob Lazar story. And I just think that there was a nice aesthetic to this, a nice artful way that you sort of eased people into the story. You're in the video quite a bit. You're talking with George Knapp quite a bit. You're talking with Lazar. And I just felt like this was, you followed a nice path toward bringing the viewer into the Bob Lazar story. And I think that works intellectually and artistically, and I liked it. So
Thanks,
I'm going to say that. So in terms of other things, like I noticed you did have Lazar's family. You mentioned his wife, Joy. You mentioned his mom. They're both in this. I thought that was very good that you interviewed them. You interviewed at least one guy who was pretty close to Bob in the before times.
Yeah, very close.
But that was really good. Is there anything about these that you want to be able to tell people just in advance so that they can have an idea of what to expect?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, you have, start with this. I wanted to know the truth about Bob Lazar. That's how I got started in UFOs. In 1989, I heard Bob Lazar, I heard George Knapp, I heard about the propulsion system, the way Bob described it, how the gravity wave amplification worked for space-time travel, and I was hooked. That was it. My curiosity was weaponized. That moment, then on the radio. Fast forward, I want to know the truth. I want to know the truth for me. So my movies are always a personal journey. My one goal with a film, to just share with you my personal journey, is to uplift the visual medium so that it reaches past the UFO crowd into the zeitgeist of the common individual who doesn't think about UFOs so much. And I want to grab them. I want to bring them in. So if I've achieved that with this film, visually, aesthetically, artistically, with a great narrator, and look, everybody wants to see Bob, so the movie's mostly Bob Lazar talking, because you get to see him in a variety of situations across 2 years of time, or actually more. My first shot in that film was from 2012. So you do the math.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, the point is, in the film, you go on this journey, and the journey is really how I got to the point of trying to understand this story. Most importantly, there are some dramatic moments in the film, and those moments were real eye-openers. And I think your audience is going to see even how the movie opens. It's very dramatic. So I want you to watch the movie. I want you to assess for yourself. And honestly, I think Bob does too. I think ultimately he let me do the movie because, he figured I'd be fair. He made one restriction on me, only one. He got no compensation. In fact, he donated all the proceeds from the live screening in Michigan to local science programs.
Interesting.
Yeah, all he wanted, the only restriction, was that I don't lie, that I tell the truth. Whatever I see, whatever I experience, he let me go through his boxes and his tapes and his documents and any cell phone to call anybody I wanted. So that was his only restriction, is don't fabricate anything. Don't make anything up. So in the movie, you're going to see the real Bob Lazar, and you're going to see the story. And I'm not telling you what to believe in the movie just because I'm passionate and I don't have the luxury of disbelief. I don't expect you to. Watch the film. Judge for yourself. That's the whole deal.
Let's talk a little bit about element 115, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
This is a very important element of the Bob Lazar story. You were getting into his scientific description of how the craft operated. And
Yes.
a lot of people aren't really familiar with nuclear physics or heavy elements, but
I wasn't either.
I think, right. What, he wasn't, you said? Or you weren't?
I wasn't either until I started calling around every heavy element particle physicist in the country and beyond.
Yeah, this is an interesting part of the show, in my opinion. But essentially, Lazar said that this element 115 was used for as the generation of energy of the craft to create the gravitational waves that it required. And of course, people said element 115. There's no such thing as element 115. That's nonsense. That's pseudoscience. We don't have any way of making a stable isotope of element 115. And of course, now years have gone by, and we have science that they still don't have a truly stable isotope of 115. But it's definitely the case that our science has gone very far down the road in understanding, and probably, it seems to me, being able to create such an element, or at least way more than we did 30 years ago. You have to say about that?
Yeah, I'm just deep, Richard. I am so deep in this. So I'm going to give it to you like I would want it to have received this information a couple years ago. I'm going to try to be very clear, very short about it, and very concise, dispelling all the mythology. And I'm going to try this quickly. So let me try it. Yes, element 115 is the core to Bob Lazar's story, one of the cores to Bob Lazar's story. Element 115 was the fuel source that he claimed powered these gravity amplification craft. These craft, there was a reactor, there was an amplification, and there were waveguides, and they amplified gravity waves. Yes, he said there were gravity waves when people were still debating if they were gravity waves. 50-50, gravitons, gravity waves. We now know gravity is a wave. Okay, cool. He got that right.
Right. Good point. I'm glad you reminded me. That was a huge issue. That was a huge issue.
Right. But Bob would say, no, Bob, and how his mind works, he'll say, well, Jeremy, I had a 50-50 chance. Who cares? Okay. So we get past that. Now, we go from there and we say, okay, element 115 never existed. For sure, he could have picked a jillion different elements. He could have picked anything, right? But he said element 115. Now, sure, we did fabricate it. Now, he did say the stable version of 115, it can never be fabricated in quantity or mass. Remember, they told him that there were 500 pounds of it that they had, somehow that they had. So he says, look, we can't.
You get the impression it was kind of like a freebie, or like we got it from them. Is that?
We'll get there. That's an interesting question. You know, how old does Bob think these craft are and all that? So we'll get into that. But, you know, let's keep on this track. So here we are, and we've got a fabrication of element 115, and Bob was completely unimpressed. However, the scientists that started working to fabricate it did consult Bob, did communicate with Bob prior. So somebody believed him, but whatever, they made some element 115. Totally unstable. Does that mean element 115 is unstable? No. There's the theorized island of stability, and in fact, it's smack right there that there should be isotopes that end up stabilizing 115. So every single particle physicist and any physicist that really would just talk to me, not about flying saucers and UFOs, but one in San Francisco in particular, one in Russia in particular, although I called about probably 9 of them, 3 of them in particular talk to me, you cannot rule out a stabilized form of element 115. Now, Bob did not say we'll ever make it on Earth. In fact, he still tells me we're not going to be able to make it on Earth, and it probably occurred naturally. So if it occurred naturally, and if he was told the truth that we had 500 pounds of it, because he only saw 228, I believe, grams of it, but if there was that much of it, it was absolutely brought here from somewhere else. So let's get it straight. Yeah. Bob Lazar said gravity is a wave. Well, he was right, but he would say I got 50-50 chance. Bob Lazar also said element 115, that was the fuel source. Stabilized, isotopically stabilized, meaning it has a half-life that is longer than just 220 milliseconds or whatever they created now, that we could actually utilize, right? And in fact, it is theorized, and we cannot rule out by the top physicists that I contacted, you cannot rule it out. People say it's pseudoscience, they need to go get a degree or shut up. That's it.
This was a really good point of the documentary. You did a really nice job of this, and the scientists that you're discussing here are they do come up in the documentary. I was really happy to see that. That was such a key part of the Lazar story. And again, right, this claim of pseudoscience really doesn't wash anymore. It's at least in relation to 115, you can't claim that that's pseudoscience.
Right. Like, it's so high tech. I mean, we're not going to be able to prove that you can amplify a gravity wave. We do not have the material science, the atomic layering and zero gravity that it would require to create a resonance machine in order to be able to amplify a gravity wave. I mean, we just don't have the material science to do it, so we can't prove all his claims. But you cannot say his claim about 115, if you're a physicist or a scientist or have any grasp on it, you cannot say that's pseudoscience. You need to go home.
Hey, for someone who didn't know a lot about nuclear physics, you're doing a pretty good job at talking the talk these days.
Hey, man, I really dug deep. There's so much in the movie I didn't show you. I mean, I have had powwows with people that will not go on camera, but gave me the lowdown. And they won't even let me. Look, not everybody wants to go on camera about UFOs. I get it. I've got no credibility to ruin, so I'm fine.
One of the things that this isn't really part of your film, but it's just worth mentioning when we talk about George Knapp. George, of course, brought Lazar's case out to the public all those years ago. He's interviewed other people in addition to Lazar. I think by his own account, at least 24, perhaps more now. And, George has mentioned this many times. He said, look, pretty much all of them have corroborated key elements of Bob Lazar's story.
Yeah, more than he can say.
Yeah, and none of them, I think none actually, have been willing to go public. But George has talked about a number of the specific cases without using names. I mean, I've listened to him talk about this. I'm sure you have too. And it's very powerful. There's Lazar's story, but it's not Lazar by himself. And I think people really need to understand this. Lazar is the first major public whistleblower on Area 51. But there have been many, many people who have followed him with verified credentials. This is really important.
Yes.
And specific confirmable information about certain elements that are going on inside Area 51, but they're not willing to come forward, and that's the problem.
Okay, so let me give you two examples here. When George Knapp was vetting the Bob Lazar story, one of the things he did was put him down smack dab in front of or on the phone with people that bona fide, no shadow of a doubt, George knew worked at Area 51. So when Bob said that he came in, he got on a bus, they asked him very basic questions about Area 51. When you land there, how it looks, the color of the paint, all sorts of things. What do you see that's obviously right there? He passed all the tests. George, beyond a shadow of a doubt, knew this guy had to be there because he could not have prepped for these questions. So when he landed there to get on the bus, to go to S4, absolutely. Now, critics will say the craziest shit. They'll say, well, you can't see S4 on any Google map. Are you freaking kidding me? That is the entire point. The entire point was that the bay doors were made to be camouflaged. They know when the Russian satellites were going. In fact, they had to change Russian satellite, flyovers because of Lazar's story, because of the popularity. There was the whole change, and then we had to adjust. And Lazar also told, when they were doing the testers model, sport model of the UFO, when to take a flyover. So they rented a satellite, did a flyover photo, and there you see something that looks like a flying saucer, right when Bob said it would. People don't know that very much. But yeah, George absolutely did get people to verify the parts they could about Lazar's story, and they can't go public, but at the time he did do that. Additionally, it was, I think, over 6 witnesses that came forward to George Knapp in the height of all this and said, okay, for example, I do the typing in these meetings where they're talking about UFOs, and I want to tell you my story. All 6 of those witnesses got visits, were threatened, their families' lives were threatened. So even that woman who came forward to this day will not talk to George Knapp about the story. They would make her burn the ribbons that she typed on for those meetings each time. Look, George Knapp is a lead investigative reporter out of Nevada. He is my mentor. I'm super lucky. He's a hell of a guy, and they don't make him like George anymore. But that's right. But here we go. Here's a guy, and he has reported on everything from the mob to religion to crime to drug addiction. He has reported on everything. He's won Peabodys and multiple, like 20-some plus Emmys. I mean, the guy has excellence in journalism beyond a shadow of a doubt, and probably more than any investigative reporter or any reporter in Las Vegas or, sorry, in Nevada. You got a guy here who has the credibility that you can't even begin to understand. And he's telling you that he went through that and that he was able to prove that. And he is satisfied. That's got to mean something. And if it doesn't, well, okay, go find another hero.
I fully agree. We've got about 10 minutes or so before we're going to wrap this up. I think, I don't know how much time you've got, but I think that's about what we're going to do. And I just want to say, Lazar, like if there are people who are doubting his story, I honestly believe it's a case of not simply not becoming familiar with all of the facts of the story. There's just too much information there supporting him. And so I would encourage anyone who really is skeptical of the Lazar story, even now, if there are such people, they should watch your documentary, but also there's just a great deal of research they can do. People like George Knapp are a good place to start as well.
Look,
but
Rich, it's okay if they're skeptical. I want them to be, but just look at the facts. Don't look at the fake news. Don't look at the stuff that other people say. Look at the facts. I want that. Bob wants that. Everybody wants.
I think by looking at all the facts, it's very hard to be skeptical of Lazar's fundamental truth. That's all I'm saying.
That's your opinion, but I agree with you. I agree with you. Yeah.
So what are the implications here? I mean, Lazar's got some historical significance.
Yeah.
And I think it would be useful for us just to talk about this. He really took the UFO cover-up theme, which was developing all through the 1970s and 80s. And here he comes now at the end of the 1980s, early 90s, and he really added a completely new dimension to that theme. And let me just state, through the 50s and 60s, the question was, we think the government's covering up something that they know about UFOs. And then the government and the Air Force would say, well, we you know, it's interesting. We've looked into it, but we don't really think that there's anything going on. Then by the late 70s, Roswell starts to really come out as a story. And all through the 1980s, you get stories about crash retrievals, primarily Roswell and others. So that takes it to a new level. Like, oh, wow, some of their stuff may have come down and we're studying it. That was very, very controversial, of course. It still is. Then comes Lazar. Lazar takes it a step further, and he's saying, we are studying this and attempting to replicate it to whatever extent we can. And that's, I mean, don't you agree? Like, that's a really important historical development there.
I think the moment now is so historic, and I want to thank you so much. You're the historian, so you're bringing this to the moment. December of 2017, we find out the United States government has been lying to its citizens, saying that our study of UFOs with Project Blue Book ended in 1969, that in fact that was a lie, and they admitted one out of multiple active UFO programs that are currently going on to study the phenomenon. They told you about ATIP, Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. Obviously, and by the way, I just want to make it very clear, just, you know, I did break that story. I broke that story before the New York Times when it comes to Commander David Fravor and the Tic Tac UFO case. Just go listen to the records. I'm
That's
saying
right.
that because I'm telling you, you should listen to me about this one. Okay. So we have this new paradigm, this new world. It is now admitted that these programs exist. You know about one of them. There are other ones. So it brings the Lazar story into focus. It brings his testimony, which is what it is. It is testimony. It brings his testimony into focus. So historically, as the historian, Richard, that you are, it is so significant, it's ridiculous. And that is why I think this is so important now. Watch the film, enjoy it, and then go deeper, go further. There's 2+ hours of bonus feature interviews, and that's not even scraping the surface. I will, over the years to come, be releasing more and more and more as it's.
Oh, I wanted to ask you about that. So I'm glad that you just mentioned bonus features. And I was curious, Tracy and I were both curious about this after we watched it, and we thought there's got to be bonus features. And can you give us a little bit of a peek or a hint as to what we might be looking at?
Yeah, man, there's everything from, you know, testimony from other family members to, you know, just people on the street, to long form interviews, uncut with Bob Lazar. So, you know, modern day interviews. So that contrast between old and new and then and now, that's represented in the bonus features. There's so much stuff. It's personal stuff. You can't jam everything into a movie and expect everybody to sit through it. That movie is kind of like, that's the premise, the base, the foundation. But there's tons that will be coming out as I continue with my process of storytelling to bring this to the audience. And I want to say one last thing before we sign off. I know we're getting close. You have the opportunity of a lifetime. There are people coming from all around the world. I have counted now 9 countries that people are coming. They've emailed me. They're coming from those countries to come to the world premiere in Los Angeles in this historic theater that Charlie Chaplin built to show his films with his friends. It is the most beautiful Gothic looking theater. It's always been my dream as a filmmaker to show there. It's called The Theater. That's at the Ace Hotel on December 3rd. I made it democratic. $20 a ticket. I need to cover my costs. It was not, I'm an independent filmmaker. I don't have a studio behind me. It is literally just me. So I rented the theater. It's $20 a ticket. It's general admission. Get there early, get in line, get a damn ticket. Watch the movie as it world premieres, because it will not be live yet to the general public on iTunes and all that. That happens at 9:30 when the movie ends, right? But I'll be hosting it with George Knapp and Bob Lazar. And I'm going to be taking questions via hashtag on Twitter or Instagram live around the world on stage right after the movie. So get your ticket, get to LA, Ace Theater, December 3rd. Oh my gosh, it's going to be amazing. And there's still tickets left, miraculously. I need to sell them, but there are still tickets left. So get one.
I'm glad you're mentioning this, and I hope you sell out. This is, for me, really significant. When you think about the transformation of the culture from when Lazar hit the scene in 89 and 90, how he was relegated immediately to the beyond the fringes got really no public attention whatsoever, beyond what George Knapp was able to do initially, and there was really no major follow-up. And now look at the situation today. We've had 25 plus years of the web, of the internet, of this connectivity where we're all in communication with each other. And this subject of UFOs, has clearly resonated with so many millions and millions and millions of people, so that you are able to create this documentary. And I am quite sure you're going to get a great deal of attention and a lot of viewers. And it's not just this documentary, like a lot of these documentaries on the UFO subject are resonating with people. And, you know, from my perspective, just seeing this transformation, and anyone like yourself, anyone who's old enough to have seen it, it's definitely palpable. Like, we can see there has been a dramatic change in how our broader culture is looking at this subject of UFOs, and people like Bob Lazar are not any longer being relegated to the fringe, and people are laughing and saying he's a faker, he's a fraud. More and more people are recognizing there's something genuine about this, and I want to know what it is. So, and you're helping to move that process along, Jeremy.
Hopefully. I mean, look, man, you know, working hard to. Here's the deal. This movie has hit a nerve. My last movie, Hunt for the Skinwalker, hit a nerve. I mean, record sales for Hunt for the Skinwalker. Why? Why? Because the appetite is there. And with each movie, I hope I'm moving the ball forward a little bit more. Look, I am just so excited, and I am so grateful as like a fan of this subject to be involved. And if I can uplift the medium, and if I can put information, good and true information forward, and get you inspired to look into this, great, because it's not me, it's not my movies, it's not even one in particular story. The truth is clear, the truth is there. You need to get out of your own way, look at the evidence, and determine for yourself what reality is. And if you can do that, if I can weaponize your curiosity in a movie, great. That's the point. It's on you. The information is there. You're right.
Wow, there's so much more I want to go over with you, but we're going to have to do this again, because you bring up, you have a gift for getting people inside these very, very significant subjects. So I know we're going to be doing this again. But Jeremy, that's all the time I got for now. So let me just thank you for appearing on this special live stream Google Hangout. It was awesome. Loved it. Hope you enjoyed it.
So much. Anytime. Thanks so much. You could go so deep into this. Anytime you want me on, let's do it. But I just want everybody out there to know, you got to judge for yourself. Watch the movie, support independent filmmaking, but more importantly, make the decision for yourself. Look at the evidence.
Absolutely. Couldn't have put it better. But with that, let's conclude this broadcast. Jeremy Corbell, thank you so very much. Your documentary on Bob Lazar, Area 51, will be out on December 3rd, premiering in Los Angeles, and I'm sure we'll be able to see it in many, many other venues.
On the 4th, worldwide, on all pay-per-view, from Amazon to iTunes, Vimeo, and beyond. Go for it.
All right, fabulous. Jeremy, thank you. We'll do this later.
All right, Richard. Thank you so much for having me on.